So welcome to the second in our Wicked Problems in a Complex World series. I'm delighted to welcome you this evening from far and wide. As you know, one of the benefits of taking this online is that we can welcome our alumni from overseas, and hopefully we've got people watching this evening from the US, Norway, Egypt, New Zealand, Canada and Switzerland, to name just a few. And we may pick up a few more in the chat if you want to tell us where you're from. So we're absolutely thrilled this evening to be joined by Sian Kevill, Newnham College 1979, who has had a prestigious career as a top-flight journalist and editor, first at the BBC, where she was the first woman to head BBC Two's late-night current affairs show Newsnight, and then CEO of the BBC's renowned international news channel BBC World News. During her BBC career, she's overseen programmes and documentaries that have won awards from a huge range of bodies, including BAFTA, RTS, Monte Carlo and ATA, as well as a personal award from Women in Television and Film for her service to UK current affairs. She went on to work with partner Sarah McDonald, co-founding Make Waves, an independent production company specialising in investigative films and international contents, which seems to have worked with more TV channels than you can shake a stick at. But the reason she's here with us this evening is she's executive feat producer on Make Waves' most recent feature documentary, The Great Green Wall. And she continues to work on that film's outreach programme, as well as on the business strategy for the company's latest film and TV projects. So, The Great Green Wall follows the project of the same name, an ambitious African-led project aiming to grow 8,000-kilometre wall of trees. And we're really thrilled to have Sian talking about this ambitious project as we're right at the beginning of our 150th. Because some of you will know that we have our own, I mean, it's pretty small scale compared with what Sian's doing, but every small act helps. So we're aiming to plant at least 150 trees around the world. Information on this is and how you can get involved can be found on our own 150th anniversary microsite. And I'm delighted that I planted the first tree in Newnham Gardens this morning. So we have one of our 150. We're also planning to organise another event with Sian later this year. We know lots of alumni and our students have interest in climate change, and she's kindly agreed to be a chair for a panel discussion to keep that going. We're looking for panellists, so anyone working in that sector, please contact the Role Office and put your names forward for consideration. I know we've got some candidates already, but we won't defer to everybody. Now, there will be a Q&A at the end of this event, which I will moderate. So please do send in your questions via the Q&A channel. I'm delighted to say we've gone up to 101 participants, but Sian, over to you.
Thank you, Alice, that's great. Well, it's a great honour to contribute to the Wicked Problems series of talks for all of you alumni out there. When I was told about Green Week and then about the global tree planting and the 150 trees that Newnham was going to plant, it just seemed to dovetail perfectly with this recent film that we made, which was called The Great Green Wall. And you know, it is about tree planting, this film, but more broadly, it's an attempt to capture the impact of climate change in Africa's Sahel region, which is just under the Sahara. So why the Sahel? Well, it is actually one of the most vulnerable places on Earth to climate change, with temperatures there rising 1.5 times faster than the global average. So these people are in the Sahel are right on the front line, and you know, that's why we chose this area. Now, before I go any further, I must say now that I am not a climate change expert. I am a generalist journalist, jobbing journalist. So I'm sure there are many better people qualified than me in the audience to talk about a lot of the science or trends. But I think what filming on the ground in a climate-stricken area does, it gives you a really, really first-hand sort of experience of the problem. And I think, interestingly, what we found in that filming added to my career in news covering world affairs. I'm really hoping that I can give you some stories and connections that will add to all of our understanding of what I personally now see as an absolutely existential crisis for humankind. It's that big. So a little bit about the film. In 2017, we were approached by the UNCCD, which is the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. And they wanted us to make a film about planting trees in the Sahel. Now, I'll have to say that as a filmmaker, that sounds pretty unpromising material. But as we talk more to the guy from the UNCCD, his name is Alex Asson, and he's quite an amazing sort of mover and shaker type person. I think he got us hooked, because this story that he was telling us was not about planting trees. It was actually about one of the planet's most ambitious climate change projects. And the aim, as Alison mentioned, was to grow this wall of trees and plants right across the entire width of Africa, from Senegal all the way through to Ethiopia, 8,000 kilometres long, 15 kilometres wide. And when it's completed in 2030, it will actually be the largest living structure on Earth. 3 times the length of the Great Barrier Reef, and I have been told that it would actually be even visible from space. So this is, as we dub it, it's like a new world wonder. Things and so many superlatives that any journalist's eyes would shine. But in a way more important than the actual physical scale of the project is the human impact. About half of the sub-Saharan African population of 1 billion is under 15. And that population is set to double by 2050. And from those millions and millions of people, 80% of them survive on some form of agriculture. So you suddenly realise how this project is not just a big world wonder. It is actually a project which will help millions survive climate change. I suppose what was amazing and possibly even, I would say, perplexing at this point was why this project, when we were told about it in 2017, it just wasn't really known. I mean, there was nothing about it in any major way at all anywhere. And, it had been going for a while. It was actually started in 2007 and it was an African project, an African vision, which was actually, rooted in some of the learnings from the 1970s when the Sahel was again rocked by a series of terrible droughts. It was a project that's led by the African Union and a broad alliance of national governments. There were about 11 African national governments when it started. There are now actually about 20. And it actually drew its inspiration from Thomas Sankara, who's a revolutionary leader who took over in Burkina Faso in about 1983. And he's known as Africa's Che Guevara. And he was a great tree planter. He really encouraged people to plant trees and to grow. And he also gave us this really wonderful phrase, which is about daring to invent the future. And that sort of became our motto, both for the Great Green Wall and for our later projects around climate change. So just in case you want to know, he was sadly assassinated about 4 years after coming into power by a Western-backed military junta. So that was the sort of background. We had no idea why this project wasn't known. It had been going for about 10 years. And I think by this point, with all the superlatives, we were absolutely hooked, and we were fully on board now to make this film and try and raise awareness and create a movement to try and make this amazing project happen by 2030. However, I would say that making films about climate change is actually quite hard. The issue is so big, it is so difficult, and in some ways it's so dark in its implications that audience, I think, often feel quite overwhelmed and defensive, and may just throw up their hands in despair and turn away. So we were, I think, faced with not only how to make a film about planting trees, but how in a way do you move on from the shock documentaries that needed to be shocking, like Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth? How did you move forward and really get people to engage with this project? So what we decided to do, particularly because it's Africa and the music there is just so part of culture, that we decided to do a musical journey along the wall with the Malian musician and activist Ina Modja, absolutely amazing artist. And she takes this epic journey right along the wall, traversing Senegal, Mali, Niger and Nigeria and Ethiopia. And as she goes, she's talking to people on the front line. She's showing the very real-time threats, to her homeland, from drought, resource scarcity, radicalization, conflict and migration. But also she worked during that period with some amazing collaborators, musical collaborators, groups like Songhoi Blues. And she created this soundtrack to inspire. And one of the things she wanted to do was to inspire young Africans that they can change their future. So that was the idea. And maybe now I'll give you a little taster of the film by running our trailer, so you can sort of see where we got to. Kate, are you okay to run the trailer now?
My home is embattled by desertification and drought, migration and conflict. Restoring the land is a matter of survival. It's up to us to create an African dream.
We're talking about revitalizing the ecosystem, the economy of communities and villages. The future generation will hold us accountable.
If people can't work their land, millions across the region will be forced to migrate.
Le convoyeur va te donner à un autre convoyeur. Tu es déjà vendu à ce convoyeur sans te rendre compte. J'ai eu 4 amis qui ont pris la balle.
The Great Green Wall, it's not just about planting trees. It has to become a movement from the whole continent, from the whole world.
Well, I have no idea whether Wi-Fi supported that into your homes, but I do hope so, and you got a sort of taster of it. You never know with Wi-Fi quite what gets through. I suppose the film actually is very hopeful and solutions-based, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But I suppose what I wanted to start to talk about was that this film and how it shifted my perceptions as a journalist quite profoundly. Over the last decade or more, I've covered 2 of the stories in this film many times, particularly conflict and radicalization and the migration story. And you are probably aware yourself or have heard of the conflict, for example, in northern Mali. And bells will ring when I talk about the infamous destruction of ancient treasures in Timbuktu. And these are by radical groups like Ansar Dine and ISIS who have taken over in this area. Or, for example, there's the threat of Boko Haram in Nigeria. And again, the very well-known kidnapping of the Chibok schoolgirls. And in fact, there have been continued kidnappings, even in the last few weeks, of schoolboys from in northern Nigeria. So that is going on even today. But in a funny way, when I covered those stories, maybe a decade ago, I really covered them through the lens of, I suppose, normal, what I would call, normal sort of journalistic analysis of the time, which was around, weak national governments, weak armies, corruption, or the Western security concerns. And it was only making this film in northern Nigeria in particular, you started to learn that, for example, Lake Chad, which has 30 million, or has had 30 million people depending on its ecosystem, that lake has shrunk by 90% over the last 50 years. Just a catastrophic decline in the ecosystem around that lake. And so you can suddenly see why something like Boko Haram flourished there, because literally there are millions with no way of now surviving, putting food on their table. They have nothing. And you suddenly realize that changing a government or sending up more troops or bringing in African Union troops or whatever, it's not really going to make a difference when the solution to these problems is so, well, it's not getting at the root causes of those problems at all. And then there was the same realization with the migration story. It's again another story that I've covered many times. I've done the heartbreaking tales of the migrants' journeys, the appalling conditions in Libyan migrant holding camps. And all of you will remember and have images of the incredibly dangerous Mediterranean sea journeys, and will know of the European attempts to discourage and remove illegal migrants, or even to pay them to go home. But again, when you start to look at this problem through the lens of climate change, from an African perspective, there doesn't seem, it just isn't a political or a security solution that can actually control what climate change is unleashing. And in order to illustrate that, I just want to play another clip from the film, which has been put together from some excerpts of a couple of stories that we covered on this theme. And I hope it gives you some idea of why, as I say, normal approaches to these problems that would have been absolutely mainstream 10 years ago just do not work anymore. So, Katie, would you mind just playing the clip on migration?
The Sahel is one of the most vulnerable places on Earth. It's on the front line of climate change. More than 80% of people survive on some form of agriculture. If people can't work their land, millions across the region will be forced to migrate. People are always asking themselves, should I stay or should I go? I heard this saying here, it's Barça ou Barsak.
Barça wala Barsak. Mooy ñiy dugg si gaal yi dem wuti. Te man moom ñaanuma yàlla dugg si gaal yi dem wuti. Fii laa bëgg a toog reste fi am li may am.
Seen idée ak ñoom li ñuy rêvé dem Barça ba yegg Barça wala Barsak, maanaam Barsak mooy dee si àll bi mooy Barsak.
C'est mort. For some people, there is no choice. You have to go. I have nothing to eat. I cannot farm. I have zero way to earn money. What should I do?
Moi, ça fait 6 ans.
Moi, je suis parti à Libye. Je prends les pilotes jusqu'à Rome. C'est échoué. Deuxième, échoué. Troisième, c'est échoué. C'est ma mère m'a dit que c'est moi qui ai le premier fils. C'est moi qui dois charger les pauvretés. Moi, je vais partir à Mali, mes villes, ça me fait honte, vraiment. Il y a des gens qui comptent sur moi. J'ai perdu beaucoup de choses, beaucoup. Vraiment, je ne sais pas comment je vais rentrer, voilà. Je ne sais pas.
Ça, vous auriez pu être mes frères. Vous ne devriez pas avoir vu ce que vous avez vu. Parce qu'on est africain, on ne doit pas vivre ça.
Being able to provide for your family is the duty of a lot of young people. A lot of them decide to go and find the opportunities somewhere else. By 2050, the number of youth expected to leave the continent will only increase. The Great Green Wall has brought hope. It's not just about planting trees. Restoring the land is a matter of survival.
Thanks, Katie. So you saw in that clip that Ina at the end talks about the millions, or the increase of people coming here. I mean, the actual estimate is that something like 60 million people will leave before 2050. I mean, that just swamps the, few millions. I mean, it's still a huge number, but few millions who are currently trying to make that journey and to come here. So you could see that, if we don't reverse climate change impact in the Sahel, there is no stopping that number of people who will have to leave because there is nothing for them where they are. So, it may be obvious, but, certainly what making this film taught me was just how interdependent our world is, and whether it is in a wet market in Wuhan or instability in Sahel, there are now consequences, for the whole world. And I think that sense of interdependence that I got from making this film was amplified by COVID and what's happened to all of us over the last year. And I think the one thing that always hits me, though, is that you cannot self-isolate from climate change. You cannot just stay home and hope that in a year it'll all be sort of past. There is no escaping. And in that sense, I do feel that we all have to step up and try and make some small difference in whatever way we can. So that's a little bit gloomy, but I do want to end or say something about hope, because, the film, The Great Green Wall, actually ends in a province in Ethiopia called Tigray. And some of you will remember that that was the scene of an absolutely apocalyptic famine that actually led to Live Aid and to huge amount of Western help going into help. Now, when you go back there, it is absolutely been transformed. Incredible local community leadership has led to water conservation and the regreening of the whole area. One of the inspirational leaders that we talked to in the film was himself a farmer during the drought, the famine, and lost many of his family, and obviously never, ever wanted to go back there, and has over a period of years and with quite a lot, outside help and investment as well, there's been this amazing regreening of Ethiopia. And it just shows what can be done. There are solutions, and the Great Green Wall is a solution. So I suppose the other thing I suppose I want to go on to say is that the Great Green Wall was one project, but having actually dipped our toes into this area now, we're now, well, more than dipped, we're completely immersed in this area now. And I have to say that there are some other amazing projects, big projects, which hold a potential key to turning back some of the tide. And we're looking at two of them at the moment. One of them is called Blue Carbon, and this is about pulling in another huge ally, another enormous way that we can change, which is harnessing the oceans. I mean, there are ecosystems in the ocean around seagrasses and mangrove swamps and others where they actually pull in more CO2 than even a tropical rainforest. These are incredibly powerful allies if we can harness them. And then we're also looking at a very interesting but quite journalistically complex area around, it's called Law of the Land. It's around giving nature human rights, or rights, not as much human rights, rights. And it's quite fascinating how as humans we have given rights to something like a company or a corporation, and yet we don't give nature any rights. And this is part of a very big movement that's starting to take off now, alongside another way of using law, which is around ecocide, which is challenging corporations and governments around destroying nature. So that's another way of using the law to try and change what's been happening in the world over the last sort of 30 years or so. What's fascinating about all these, and you even heard when I was talking about the Great Green Wall earlier, these were all quite lone voices. They all seem quite fringe groups who've been ploughing their furrow for years with nobody really listening, often dismissed as sort of dreamers. And you can really start to feel like the Great Green Wall. These are initiatives with huge implications, and they're really gathering momentum and have the sort of the potential for the scale of change that we need. So I'm going to play one last little clip, which is to give you a taster of these two, a few films that we're thinking of making, including these two. So Kate, maybe just play the last little clip, that would be great.
Something that is not alive, that's a human-made abstraction, a corporation, has the rights of personhood. But nature is not. Nature, which is alive, doesn't have any legal rights.
Well, we have yet another example of an oil giant that has shown the world it intends to play by the rules only when it suits them.
Oil spills have contaminated the Ecuadorian Amazon.
How does a small community like us defend our territories and our culture against the big forces that are wanting to destroy our land?
Chevron for decades deliberately dumped billions of gallons of toxic, cancer-causing oil waste onto the ancestral lands in Ecuador.
Chevron's board has attacked the Ecuadorian's attorney, Stephen Donziger.
One judge claimed he was bribed by lawyers to testify.
The judge had me locked up where I've been unable to leave without permission of a court officer.
environmental rights activist, remains in critical condition after being shot multiple times outside his home.
This is in a context in which indigenous people in the Philippines has been deeply involved in defending their natural resources. President Duterte has said that if you are somebody who's a rebel, that he will kill you.
This is a sickening business, and it's got to be stopped. To confine that animal to a 50-foot pen is inhumane.
Galit-Taktanat is sacred to the Lummi and has vast cultural importance to them.
Lummi tribal members are exercising our inherent right to file an intention to sue for the return of Galit-Taktanat.
We move to Ecuador, where the country could see changes to its constitution.
Reconocer la naturaleza como una entidad dotada de derechos es jurídicamente posible.
This is a country where indigenous people's voices are heard, and that constitution is the first in the history of the world and changes everything.
This act concludes that the forest has an identity in and of itself with all the rights, powers, duties, and liabilities of a legal person.
If we're to survive, if nature is to survive, we have to make a fundamental shift. And that shift is beginning to happen.
A few countries have bought into the concept.
India has recognized a river as a living entity.
The Wanganui River in New Zealand will be granted its own legal identity.
The locals are fighting for their lives right now.
It takes a David versus Goliath style fight.
We're not going to stand by. We're going to take action.
She belongs to the sea.
We need to stop pretending that we can create the world that needs to be by working around the edges of the system of law that is.
How different would our world be if before a corporation could go in and rip up the land and inject poisonous water underground, if they had to recognize the personhood of that land, the sacredness of that land?
That's great, Katie. Thank you. So that was actually a full trailer of one of the films, Law of the Land. I'm afraid there was a mix of a trailer where you'd got a flavour of blue carbon as well. But, I think that gives you a real sense that of some of the other big projects that are out there happening at the moment in this area. And I'll finish up now, but just to say that all of these films come with an impact and outreach campaigns. Great Green Wall has been shown at the UN General Assembly and UN Climate Summits, EU Commission. So it really is putting a lot of pressure. It was on the One Planet Summit at the beginning of the year, where about £40.5 billion has been donated through French auspices through to the Great Green Wall. And there's now a real move to I'm now working with another body to try and create a grassroots movement along the Great Green Wall to really try and bring communities together and to exchange information and best practice, and to create this sort of grassroots push from the bottom up as well as the top down with all the French stuff, to make this project happen. So that's it. And I have to say, if you're at all interested, even in a small, that's quite big stuff, but there's very small stuff, which is, please, you could go onto a website called greatgreenwall.com and you can join up to hear about the movement, and you can also even donate to planting more trees there. So that's rounded off everything.
Thank you so much, Sian. And certainly on my screen, those trailers came across really well. And one of the questions we've got is the question I was going to ask, which is, personally, I'm ashamed that I haven't seen the films, but I haven't. How would we see each of them if we wanted to?
Well, I have to say that it's not as an easy an answer as I would like to give, because it's currently in distribution, and we have distributors in the UK, for example, who are looking to try and find a TV outlet for it. If nothing else, it's going to be on a pay-to-view platform at some point, I think, in the next month. So it will be available. I think if you sign up, we can obviously, there will be updates for people who want to watch the films. We'll be able to send those out. There is also a chance to sign up and for viewings, to do screenings. They may not happen immediately, but we there are ways in which we can make those happen. And sometimes if it's a particularly big one or very important one, I can sometimes make that happen. The unfortunate thing about making films is you also have to try and make some money.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I'm sure
that's the bit that really, well, actually, strangely, one of the things we've learned from making Great Green Wall is that we want to try and go down a different route and get more grant space next time, so that we can actually release it immediately to everyone, because actually these films are all about getting people to watch and people to engage. So it's been a bit frustrating with Great Green Wall, to be honest.
And the Blue Carbon and Law of Land, they're still in production, are they?
Yeah, they're still in production. We've had development funding for both, but we're now raising the money now to go into full production on them both. Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm sure we'll see. We'd love to see if we can find ways when we're allowed to watch things all together again. That will be.
We'll be back in 2022 for those.
So lots of questions. So somebody says, what advice would you give those of us trying to engage people to take practical action on climate change? How can we best use our communications to engage people in a way that encourages action rather than despondency? This is Saskia Huggins.
Yeah, and as it's something, as I said, we really struggled with in trying to think about how to make these films. And I think the one thing is hope. I think it's really important to make people feel that if they do anything, actually, it's going to help. And it can be as small as looking at more sustainable products in their home, up to obviously engaging and helping on a big project like the Great Green Wall if you've got particular skills that could help. So it's about making people, and I said I've gone through a learning process, actually understanding, I suppose, the scale of the problem that we are now facing. And I think it's allowing people to go on that journey with you. You may be ahead of them, but let them catch up, let them understand, and then try and give them some concrete things that they can do to feel that they can do something to help. And I think that's the main advice I can give. I mean, if you want to add in music and make it fun to watch, that's great as well. But primarily, I think hope and some practical things that you can tell people to do are the keys.
I think you've answered this next, John, both in your questions about what you're thinking about funding and in what you just said. But it's an interesting question, so I'll just see if you think there's another angle. Have your opinions on the role of the media in showing the world the effects of climate change changed at all through what you've been doing?
As I say, I think that the thing for me that hit me is that that in a way that a lot of the problems that we just report about are caused by climate change, but that connection is often not made in a lot of the reporting of the particular issues that are being covered. And I understand as a journalist, you can't do it every time. I mean, it would become relentless and probably self-defeating if you sort of did it every time. There's obviously individual problems you also need to look at, and some of the more specific reasons why they happen. But I think that it is such a big problem. I think that news organisations are slowly, doing a lot on climate change. And this year, I'm afraid you will see a huge amount, because at the end of the year, there's COP26, which was delayed, but which is the big climate change. I mean, it's seen as a pivotal climate change summit, which is going to be in Glasgow at the end of the year, hosted by the Brits. And, that is seen as one of the last moments when you might be able to engage people in making very hard decisions. And I think that's the other thing which needs to be acknowledged, that this isn't easy. I mean, it challenges current power structures. The solutions are not there, and they take a long time, and you have to start and commit and keep going at them, even when, a bit like the Great Green Wall, it's a long-term project, and we need to commit and make it happen. I think there's more grounds for optimism now, and I do think most of the news organisations are trying to cover this in a way that allows people to understand it, and they don't really ask people to engage. I mean, that's sort of something needs to be done elsewhere, like with the films I'm making. But you're going to get a lot of it this year. I suppose I could say that for sure.
Yes, that's an interesting one, because somebody else has written, and I'll simplify a little bit, that feeling that really journalists could do a lot more to link, extreme weather or whatever to climate change. And I think what you've been saying is journalists, if they do that all the while, people switch off. And also there's a difference between news and promoting action. Yeah. That one has to be aware of, I suppose, in terms of presenting. But your feeling is that journalists are doing more to sort of make those links, but also using different formats in different ways that are appropriate.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think that if you think now, even in the coverage of things like forest fires now, as opposed to even three or 4 years ago, at that point, there was still very much a sort of sense, well, it might just be it might be a one-off. It could just be a particular quirk of the weather at the moment. And I think we have moved from that to people now, saying much more categorically that, it seems to be, it now seems to be much more linked to disruptive patterns of weather, which are connected to climate change. And that's actually been quite a recent shift. And I suppose that's because, this was still a contentious, and even now, it's still a contentious issue. I are people who are still climate change deniers. I think slowly the pendulum has tipped so far that, I think journalists feel that they're on much, that they certainly the experts that are expert journalists, who cover these things for the BBC and others, feel that they're on very safe ground now to say that this does seem to be part of, disruptive patterns of weather, which cause things like forest fires and so forth. So, as I said, I think it's going to become more of a drumbeat through a lot of coverage from here on in. And obviously, if things get worse before they get better, assuming they'll get better, it's going to, dominate. It is going to dominate everything, whether we like it or not.
A more practical question now. Can you tell us a little bit about what the role of the producer is in making a film like this?
It starts off, I suppose, it starts off that you have to find something you believe in. And as I said, we started off thinking, oh my God, planting trees in Sahel. And then actually, after we suddenly realised what this project was all about, you start to think, no, this is an amazing, that people need to be told about this. So I suppose the producer is somebody who has to find the passion to want to tell this story. And obviously there are thousands of stories to be told, so there are many passions that can be had. So first of all, it's a passion. Then it is actually about raising money to make it, and that is not easy. It's been very difficult during COVID, when so much funding has just had to be withdrawn for all sorts of obvious, but undeniable reasons. So it's about raising money, finding somebody who, either a television channel who will buy it, or investors who will invest in it. So it's pulling together the money while you're also pulling together the editorial vision of the film. And those two go hand in hand, because you need to be able to say how you're telling the story in a way that makes somebody want to give you money. So those two things go together. And hopefully, if you're successful, you then have to produce the film. And that means you have to create the team. You have to find, in this case, we had to find Inamoja, who's an amazing artist, to do this journey. We had to find a director, who was prepared to both deal with music, but also with, going onto the front lines of Boko Haram and radicalization. Often that's quite hard to find a director who can deal with those two ends of the spectrum. And you then get into the hard work of how do you go, how do you film, how do you get there, made even more difficult at the moment with COVID. And then you're working with a team on getting people onto the ground into very difficult areas, ensuring that they're safe and secure. And then after that, you then go into the whole process of creating the film and editing it. Having been, having made sort of 3-minute news packages at some point in my life, all the way now through to sort of 90-minute directors, and you realise there are director's cuts. I mean, there are so many cuts that you can make, and so many ways to tell a story. It takes sometimes like 30 weeks to edit a film, sometimes longer. So it's at this end of the scale, it's a very, very long process. The whole production cycle, it's very long. And now I realise that it doesn't even finish then, because then you have festivals, you have outreach, you have all of those other things. So I can't see myself stopping being involved with Great Green Wall for maybe another 3-4 years. Probably it'll go on forever, though not necessarily related at that point to the film, because I think all of the team are so sufficiently committed now that we'll probably stay involved in other ways, in whatever way we can. So that gives you
it's really helpful for people who don't know as much about film, but it triggers a personal question for me, which is, it's easy from an outsider to think, oh, Sian's been in broadcasting all her life, but in a sense, it's a totally different sort of career that you're doing now. First of all, how did you decide to make that transition, and how did you skill yourself up for that transition?
I think it was it's difficult, I think, is the answer. I mean, when you've been working in an institution like the BBC, I sort of said, if I'd been, there are sort of two different. I think there are two different characters. There are people like me who are more institutional, and there are people who run production companies from very early on in their careers, or make individual products in a freelance way. Sometimes that's lots of women are doing that now, but in my day, I mean, actually having a job where if you had children and you wanted maternity leave and things like that, it was much better to go into an institution. So that was part of the reason why I stayed at the BBC, and because it's a fascinating place to work, for as long as I did. I think there comes a natural point at the end of any long institutional career where you realise that you don't really want to do anything else in that institution. You've done the bits that you found fascinating, and what's on offer now is not as interesting. So I took the decision to leave at that point, and I was just very lucky that I kept in contact with. And that's, it's always worth keeping contact with people who are very talented. And I kept in contact with a very talented producer called Sarah McDonald, who is a natural freelancer and runs production companies. And I suppose I sort of got into it through that. I've always loved running my own bits. I've always, Newsnight was its own little empire. World News was its own little empire. So I like running things which I have control of, as opposed to having to work a lot with other people telling you what to do. So this was perfect in a way, and it's allowed for me a whole new chapter in my career over the last 10 years, and and fascinating. And what I love about it is that you are totally in control when you do run your own company. You hire the people you like. You can take days off if you want. I mean, though you tend to work more than you take days off, I have to say. But, I like just having control over my life and doing what I want when I want.
Oh, thank you. So to take back to some of the questions more around the film, what was the moment that perhaps most overturned your expectations in filming these documentaries?
As I said, I think in The Great Green Wall, it was just really, if you can watch the film, which I do hope you all can at one point, and obviously I will let Alison know if we get somewhere where you can watch it, so you can pick it up. I think what really got me on that one was it was a real African story. It's all it was all Africans throughout the whole story, looking at their continent and their hopes and their aspirations, and it, because you could bond with Ina and the people she was traveling with, you really started to see the problems through their eyes, and I think that really started to make you realise that why this amazing continent with these amazing, incredible people were being subjected to a future which was, where there was no future for so many of their young people who are growing up on that continent at the moment. And I think seeing Ina go through that herself and realising that, there needed to be this, in a sense, an African dream, like there was an American dream, that that really started to, connect with me in a way that I hadn't before. And I suppose in terms of the other films, it's just this fascination in the way that ideas which were seemed quite quirky maybe 10 years ago, now actually maybe hold the solution to our future. And that again was something which is, really, just overturned the way I thought about things.
Yes, I was particularly interested in what you were saying about the law of the land and giving nature rights. And someone's question is, have you experienced, sorry, this is Belinda Copland, have you experienced much pushback or challenge from corporate entities whose interests are being affected, especially law of the land type issues?
Oh, yes.
You talked about the dangers of, being on a war zone or whatever, or being in COVID, but presumably there are also powerful corporate entities who would rather you weren't telling these stories.
Yes, Law of the Land is going to be a very tricky film to make, bluntly, because one of the central stories is about a lawyer called Stephen Danziger, who literally has been put under house arrest by Chevron. He is the lawyer who has challenged them and working with the local indigenous tribes in Ecuador to challenge Chevron. And they have, as you saw, you got glimpses of it. There is corruption. There is they have corrupt judges. He is still under house arrest. He cannot leave his house. So yes, the big corporations are absolutely fighting this and will fight it. But that's great. It's even more reason to make the film.
Yes, but whereas in the BBC, you've got sort of whole teams of lawyers sort of backing you up on what you say and that sort of thing. Presumably, it's a bit harder as a smaller production company to.
Yeah, we will have lawyers all over it. There will be a big part of our budget will have to have a big legal line in it. Yes. So yes, it will be that is going to be a very difficult film to make, and we'll have to see what happens. But you know, it's a very important film.
Very, very important.
And as I said, there are other legal channels through Ecocide, which is the other big legal channel that people are pursuing at the moment. So it's really interesting what's going on in the legal world around this.
And then one final, again, more practical question. Is, obviously you've worked abroad a lot for what you've been doing, and Harriet asks, sometimes working abroad, it's the smallest things that are the biggest challenges. Did you experience that?
Well, I'm going to own up and say that I personally didn't go shooting in Senegal, Niger and all the rest of it, because obviously we have a team who goes and does that. But, you know, I certainly can, you know, from having talked to the team, you know, I think it's just the scale of Africa, the size of it was one of the things which so hard, you know, just the sheer number of miles that you have to traverse to make the story in the way that we set out to make it as a sort of a journey. And yeah, and then yes, I mean, I know exactly what she's saying, and yeah, there lots of instances during my career of things like that, but I have to say I can't remember any of them at the moment.
And is it Great Green Wall? Is it? I mean, I've just looked on the website. It looks as though it's already existing, isn't it? It's making progress.
It's existing, but the progress is slow. I think about 14 or 15% have been built when we made the film. In the last year or so, it's gone up to 18%. Obviously, with the French 4.5 billion, there's going to be a real push now to move it on. But you know, you know, I have to say, you know, it is a difficult project. I mean, it's going through areas where there is, as you know, as I've talked about, there's huge instability. Lot of fighting and conflict, so it's not easy. But at the moment, there's about I think I've got some. There's about 15 million hectares which have been restored in Ethiopia, and Senegal has gone great guns. They've got about 17 million drought-resistant trees now, sort of planted through their area, and in Niger they've also restored about 5 million hectares. So it is happening, and Ethiopia has gone, you know, as I say, it's got huge amounts sort of done. So it is really, it is gathering pace. Whether the whole of it, in the concept of it as literally a band of trees through the whole 8,000 kilometres eventually happens, I don't know. But I think that a large percentage of it will be done, and it will transform the lives of just millions and millions of people who otherwise might feel that they have to, you know, try and go over the Mediterranean to find some way to live.
Sian, we're coming up to 7 o'clock, so we ought to draw to a close, but thank you so much. I think what's been particularly interesting is, you know, to see how whatever one's skill set, and you've got an amazing skill set, that you can put it to use for these great causes. As you say, you're not claiming to know every bit of the calculation behind the temperature rises, but you know how to tell a story in a difficult place, to raise money, to inspire people, and to just get, you know, amplify those stories. And as you say, I was really struck by what you're saying about the hope, because I think it's so important. I mean, yes, it's a huge challenge, but if we don't believe we can make a difference, people tend to go into the what's the point. So I think the role of media in helping people see agency, I think, is really, really important. So I can't wait for the panel on climate change that you're going to share for us later. And also I really, really hope we can find a way to show the film at Newnham, and perhaps subscribe to one of the channels. So do please keep us posted. Thank you everybody very much for joining. Thank you for these great questions, and have a great evening. Thank you, Sian.
Thank you very much.